Trustee McGrory, will you please convene the Committee on Finance?
Thank you, Chair Kimbell. Will the meeting of the Committee on Finance please come to order? It is now time for the committee to consider today's consent agenda. Does any committee member wish to remove an item for separate discussion?
Chair McGrory?
Yes, sir.
I have two questions regarding item number 2, so I don't know whether I need to remove it from the consent or whether I can just ask my question.
Remove it.
Then I remove it. Then I'll make the request to remove it.
Okay. So we'll only be voting on item 1, the approval of the minutes. Hearing none, is there any objection to the approval of item 1 on the consent agenda? Hearing none, the consent agenda is approved. The committee has 3 items on today's discussion agenda, and the first will be the California State University Quarterly Investment Report. And why don't we hear your questions first and then figure out where we go from here, Robbie?
Yes, thank you. The first one is maybe a question, maybe more in line with what I said earlier, give credit where credit is due. I see, if I read it correctly, that the return in the 12 months investment return of our total return portfolio is 35.5%. I mean, if this is true, this is sensational, and we should not let this disappear in consent, but really, I mean, announce it as a great success and compliment our team of investors, because I mean, this is, I understand that you just about a year ago there was a big dip in the stock market and we might have recovered a lot of those setbacks, but a return of 35% a year is just sensational. And my question is this really true that our total return for portfolio yielded a 35.5% return? And my second question is a bit in connection to the public speakers who called for divestment of fossil fuels. And for me and the board, I guess, to better understand what impact that would have if we were to discuss that idea, can we get a ballpark figure of how much of our CSU investments are currently invested in fossil fuels?
I think your first question was more a comment, and I think it's a credit to Steve Relier and his staff and Makita, who is our investment advisor, as to how the portfolio has been put together and well managed by Steve and his staff. On the second issue, that is a conversation. And by the way, I think we also ought to give a lot of credit to former trustee Taylor, who really was the one who pushed for this allocation, the 30% going into the total return portfolio. And the staff has done a very good job of managing up to that limit. I think we're at about 26% right now. Because we have some liquidity issues we have to deal with in terms of expenses. But I think, again, Steve's done a great job. On the second question, we are debating this now at the Investment Advisory Council. I think some of the speakers mentioned I have met with the student proponents for divesting from fossil fuels. It's not as clear an issue as you think, because a lot of these companies, you divest from them, they're also making the pivot to go into alternative energy. And so you're kind of hurting yourself in some ways when you just divest totally. And our total exposure to fossil fuel companies is around 250 million. If I'm right, Steve, I think that was the number we've been using. But we have another meeting on this in October, and we intend to come back to the board in November with a full discussion of the item.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no other comments, I will assume that formally item 2 on the consent agenda has been approved. Item 3 is an information item providing the annual system-wide report on hate incidents on campus. The item will be presented by Steve Relier and Melinda Lattis.
Okay, thank you, Trustee McGrory. Just one comment before we launch into this item. On this last item, I also, in addition to the great work that Robert Eaton and his team have done on our investments, I also want to thank Trustee McGrory, who's chair of our Investment Advisory Committee. And what we've been very lucky to be able to do is cherry pick some of the best volunteers from campus, CSU campus foundations, who have great expertise in investing as part of their career. So we've got just a fantastic committee that represent foundation members with investment expertise at a lot of our campuses. And I want to just recognize the role that they play in the performance of that portfolio. So we've been very fortunate. As you maybe know, the proceeds of that portfolio go directly into our most critical deferred maintenance projects on our campuses. And so it is really money that's important and well spent. So sorry for that backtrack, but I just wanted to just recognize the role of the committee in that. Trustee McGrory, thank you for introducing the next item on the annual system-wide report of hate crimes. Each year, we report to the trustees the number of hate incidents that are reported on each of our 23 campuses. And so this agenda item includes the report for the calendar year 2020, pursuant to the format that we use that's stipulated in the California Education Code. Joining me today is Melinda Latas, the Director of System-Wide Clarity and Campus Safety Compliance. And Melinda joined us, the Chancellor's Office, in July of 2020. And prior to joining us, Melinda served as the Clarity Coordinator at the Ohio State University. So Melinda will present the annual report and provide additional information regarding the broader context for the clarity and safety compliance requirements throughout the system. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melinda.
Thank you, Executive Vice Chancellor Rellier. I appreciate the opportunity to address the Board of Trustees today regarding these important matters concerning student safety. As Steve mentioned, annually we report hate crimes and incidents as defined by the California Education Code. Hate violence captures those incidents that do not meet the definition of a hate crime under California law, such as physical intimidation or physical harassment, physical force or physical violence, or the threat of physical force or physical violence. As the table shows, the CSU reported no incidents of hate crimes during calendar year 2020 and reported only one incident of hate violence. It is likely that reduced campus in-person activities associated with the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in fewer reported hate crimes and incidents of hate violence during the most recent calendar year. Based on the definitions in the California Education Code, this report excludes incidents that are neither criminal nor violent, such as inappropriate speech or the use of slurs or verbal harassment that does not include a threat of bodily harm. Additionally, incidents that occur off campus are not included in these statistics. These nonviolent and non-criminal or off-campus incidents may still result in significant disruption on the campus, regardless of the reporting classification. It is important to note that in addition to this report, campuses also report hate crimes annually as part of the annual security report published by each campus, pursuant to the Jean Cleary Disclosure of Campus Security Policies and Campus Crime Statistics Act, which we will discuss next. Cleary hate crime statistics are prepared using federal definitions of hate crimes, and they include property owned and controlled by both the campus and by recognized student organizations. These hate crime statistics can be found in the campus annual security reports, which will be published by each campus this month. As mentioned before, I joined the CSU just over a year ago as the first full-time system-wide Clery and campus safety compliance officer. Clery is a federal statute that requires institutions of higher education to proactively communicate information about reports of crime as a condition of their participation in Title IV federal student aid programs. We also focus on other campus safety compliance matters, including the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, or the DFSCA. Over the past year, we have focused on establishing system-wide compliance program expectations and supporting campus Clery directors. I am pleased to report that all campuses have identified a Clery director manager as required by CSU policy. I am grateful to the campus Clery directors for their dedication and hard work over the past year to implement a complex and evolving federal and state regulatory framework. In the fall of 2020, the U.S. Department of Education replaced the 200-page guidance document that had been used in the past to prepare the campus security reports with a 13-page appendix to the Federal Student Aid Handbook. While the change reduced some regulatory burden, we are working with campus Clery directors and national subject matter experts to further refine definitions and reporting requirements for 2021. I work closely with the 23 campus Clery directors to engage and educate critical campus partners, chancellor's office colleagues, and other affinity groups to reinforce the Clery directors' efforts on their campuses. Early collaborations with colleagues in academic and student affairs at the chancellor's office, who coordinate wellness and basic needs initiatives, have already helped our efforts to improve compliance with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss these important topics related to student safety in the CSU. And I'll now turn the presentation back to Steve for some closing comments.
Thank you, Melinda. So trustees, we hope that this report has provided you with a better understanding of the annual reporting requirements and the efforts to engage and educate critical campus partners to improve the compliance with these requirements. The California State University remains committed to promoting and supporting a safe and inclusive campus environment for its students, employees, guests, and communities. This concludes the presentation, and Melinda and I are happy to answer any questions.
I guess, Steve, one question that the definition begs is what there are significant non-criminal but harassment and racial events going on a campus. Is there a way to track the significant ones so we can figure out where problems are occurring? Because, I mean, this is a pretty restrictive definition here for hate crimes.
Melinda, would you like to answer that?
Sure. In the written item associated with this presentation, there's some discussion of prevention and response efforts that are managed on campuses. So campus police are often part of that response. Title IX, discrimination, harassment, folks on the campus, student affairs, whether it's residence life or the Dean of Students office, are also often involved. Their focus is on preventing the reoccurrence and mitigating the effects through whatever means the campus is able to provide. So as far as reporting of those incidents goes, I do believe most of our campuses do some type of climate survey. Those are generally the best way to track these types of data if you're looking for actual occurrences, because they can be reported anonymously. They capture things that an individual may or may not have been comfortable coming forward to a formal reporting entity for. And they also include, as you mentioned, these broader items that still have significant impact, even if they're not classified as criminal or violent.
Does every campus have to do a campus survey, a climate survey?
I don't know the answer to that. We'd have to ask one of our colleagues over in the academic and student affairs area, I believe.
Just that's a way I think you're going to identify longer term problems, is having that kind of a survey and then start pinpointing where your issues are and directing prevention towards those areas.
We have, in the past year or so, we have asked each of the presidents, if they haven't done so already, and most of them had done so already, to establish campus safety advisory committees made up of the broad campus community, including students, faculty, staff, and other constituents. So those groups, I know that they look at certain kind of climate data, but it's not standardized across the campuses. It usually, because oftentimes campuses are trying to collect other data as well, and so they try to fit it into those processes.
And another item I'll share is that The Cleary numbers, which we mentioned that the campuses published to their communities later this month in the annual security report, they include a bit more than what the California law includes. They're still limited to items that meet the definition of a hate crime. But if something, for example, happened at a recognized Greek chapter house and it was a violent or criminal incident, it would appear in those annual security reports versus it would not appear here. So there are other various metrics that include more than what you see here, just for another piece of the puzzle.
Okay, Trustee Reynes.
Thank you, Chair McGorry. I had a question regarding Cleary. I was wondering the process of actually reporting these crimes. Do the crimes have to be reported to UPD or police, or can they be reported to other campus administration or advocates? I'm just concerned about students that don't want to report to police, and they would rather talk to somebody who's more informed about like issues, especially if it's a really traumatic experience. How can students report if they don't feel comfortable talking to police about it?
So thank you, Trustee Reynes, for that excellent question. I'm going to ask Melinda to address that.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you asked this question because it is very important for our community to understand. Police are one element of what the federal law lays out as a campus security authority with reporting obligations under this law. But there are several other categories, and those categories include our Title IX coordinators on the campuses. They include many individuals in the student affairs area. They would include individuals employees might come forward to if we laid out in our materials educating those employees that these are resources for them to report incidents to, whether they occur in the workplace with their manager, et cetera. So there's a campus by campus determination in light of the federal definitions as to which individuals meet the definition of a campus security authority. But in their process each year, campus Cleary directors who are actually outside of police request statistics from police, but they also request statistics from these other offices and from individuals who meet the definition of a campus security authority. So it's a very broad pool of individuals that our students, staff, or faculty might confide in that we would include their items.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Trustee Adamson.
As a follow-up to Crystal's question, Steve or Melinda, is there an obligation within our system for mental health counselors to report incidents that are being disclosed to them?
Melinda, you want to take that?
Absolutely. Not under the Cleary Act or under this California statute. There's actually an explicit carve out for either professional licensed counselors in session with a client or for pastoral counselors, such as our Maritime Academy has some chaplains that are associated with the campus. Those individuals are excluded by law, and that's intended to be for the benefit of the persons who might wish to talk to those individuals. But obviously it does mean that there could be some incidents that are excluded from the statistics. But we do feel that it's important for survivors of crime to have the opportunity to choose how their incidents are reported and to whom. So I think that that's a positive thing for our community.
Well, but do we follow up and do we train our mental health professionals to help guide a potential victim to that reporting process if they're, and help them in that process so they feel more comfortable reporting those incidents?
From the Cleary side, I can speak to that. There's a requirement that each of our 23 campuses in their annual security report describe to the community whether or not their professional and pastoral counselors are encouraged to give reporting options as part of the session. For some of the campuses, that answer is yes. For some of them, that answer is no. The Cleary directors consult with the officers in those roles to say, as part of your intake and as part of your work, do you give people reporting options, or do you simply listen and answer questions and refer if you're asked to do so? Someone else could speak more directly to the training that's provided for those officials, but I can tell you that the community, if they look at the annual security report, will have information about whether or not that office is a resource that will give them reporting information.
So it's up to that office to make their determination whether they'll do it or not.
The office and the campus as partners, I would say.
Okay. Any other questions from the board? Thank you for that presentation. And we'll move on now to item number 4. The item will be presented by Steve Relier and Ryan Storm, and it's planning for the 2022-2023 operating budget.
Okay, well, thank you again, Trustee McGrory. So the purpose of this item is to provide the board with a preliminary operating budget plan for the 2022-23 fiscal year. In other words, the year that starts on July 1st of 2022, and solicit your comments and feedback on that draft plan and our thinking behind that. That input will then be used to craft the final budget plan that will be presented as an action item to the board at its November meeting. So there are really 4 key items to consider as we begin the budget planning for this coming year. And those 4 items will really serve as the outline for our discussion this afternoon. The first is CSU's main goal, which of course is to continue to get students to their degrees sooner, in greater numbers, and to eliminate equity gaps. There are many initiatives and efforts and you heard a little bit from Executive Vice Chancellor Alva's group about those initiatives and our progress there, and you'll be hearing more in the future. Second, we'll go over the current resources that are available to the CSU, where we currently sit. Third, we'll consider California's economic circumstances, where the economy is heading, how it impacts the state's finances, and of course then impacts the CSU's future budgets. And then finally, we'll talk about the size and components of potential elements of the 22-23 budget plan. So those are the key items that we're going to cover this afternoon. Before we get into the material, and as a refresher for current trustees and also to help some of our newer trustees who are new to this process, I'd like to review the annual budget timeline to orient you how this cycle works. So on this chart, you'll see that we're combining the CSU and state milestones of the budget process into sort of an overlapping display. So if we start on the left side of the chart, and you'll see that we begin with the planning phase each year at the September board meeting in purple there, and finalize the details of the official CSU budget request at the November board meeting for that next fiscal year. So if you see right below the September and November markers, you see the purple boxes that indicate the board's role in that initial part of this process. So then you move down to the green area. The state process begins with the governor's proposed budget in January. We have state budget deliberations that occur throughout the spring and ends with the governor and legislature finalizing the budget in June. And then near the bottom of the chart in red, you'll see the chancellor's office, campuses, and students finalizing plans for the coming year. And obviously, a lot of those plans are impacted by the budget decisions that have been made by the university and the state.
Steve, is that
Steve,
go ahead.
I haven't seen any. Are you doing a PowerPoint?
Oh, I am. Yeah. And I don't know. I'm sorry. I thought the PowerPoint was running.
No.
Okay.
I thought it might have been my computer.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. Well, is it okay if I just kind of read, because it may have been hard to follow if you weren't looking at this chart. I assumed that you were looking at this chart. So I'm going to just very briefly go over this again, because I think it's particularly helpful for some of our newer trustees who haven't been through this process. So again, you start at the upper left-hand side, and you'll see these couple of purple boxes. That's moving left to right. We start with September meeting of the board, talk about the budget as we're doing at this meeting. And then in November, we will talk about an action item to finalize the budget, those two boxes in purple. You move down from that, and in green, the state process begins with the governor's proposed budget in January, the state budget deliberations throughout the spring, and ends with the governor and the legislature finalizing the budget in June. And then finally, on the lower part of the chart in red, you've got the chancellor's office, campuses, and students finalizing their plans for the coming year. And as I had mentioned earlier, those processes can be, and I'll give an example of this, how they can be affected by what's going on in the other parts of this chart. So simply put, it's not a perfect process. It's asynchronous is probably the best way to describe it. And I'll give you primarily a good example of that, and that is how we handle enrollment. So campuses, as you can see, will learn in mid-July, less than 2 months before the start of the fall term, how much more or how much less funding they'll receive to support a certain number of students. However, as you know, campuses make admission decisions in the early winter and spring months, well before that final state budget funding is determined. So that is part of the challenge of this process. And our presidents are very good at navigating through those challenges and doing their best to anticipate what that funding is going to look like, but it is far from perfect. But those are the cards that were dealt. So with that primer, I'm going to turn it over to Assistant Vice Chancellor Ryan Storm to walk us through the key considerations of the budget plan.
Well, thank you, Steve. Our goal is continued student success, and that requires consistent, significant investments in our budget. So on the screen are several CSU budget priorities. I'll explain each of these priorities and how they are critical pieces of the university and how they contribute to our mission and values under the umbrella of student achievement. So as an example, we are relentlessly focused on meeting our graduation initiative 2025 goals, especially closing that equity gap. We've talked about that already today in this meeting. So in support of those goals, we laid out a 6-year, $450 million investment plan. And this will be the final year of that investment plan, and it is important to finish this strong. Also, 3/4 of our operating budget consists of salaries and benefits. So for salaries, to keep pace with inflation and to cover related healthcare and pension cost increases, it requires tens of millions of dollars more per year to cover these foundational investments in the university. Now, to effectively educate all of our students, we must significantly invest in critical infrastructure while also refurbishing and building new academic facilities to best serve our students. And there is a need to regularly add more enrollment over the next several years so that by 2030, it would mean that we will have done our part in laying a strong foundation for California's future economy with degree-holding, well-educated citizenry. And lastly, for this slide, the CSU has been forever changed because of the pandemic. The overall number of hybrid and fully online courses will be significant, not the exception as they were before the pandemic. How that eventually looks is still under discussion, but certainly many aspects of CSU's technology infrastructure will have to be of exceptional quality and performance going forward. And for students, broadband and device access is and will continue to be critical to our educational experiences. Now that we've identified our budget priorities in support of student success, the question becomes, does the CSU have the resources to support those priorities? And so every year at this time, we give kind of a little primer about what our budget looks like. And so next handful of slides are going to be that. And so let's start here look at some high-level information on the CSU budget, very high level at this point. So this pie chart is a depiction of the CSU's total revenue collected last year. Now, this information is regularly available on CSU's Financial Transparency Portal website. You just go to our homepage and type in the word transparency in the search, and there you go. You can have at it. Take a look at all different revenue sources and and that kind of thing. So we just make that information available to all of you to peruse it as you wish. Now, if we look at the green section here, that represents our enterprise activities of the university, such as student housing, professional and continuing education, and student centers. So capital, debt service, and donations for designated purposes are also included in this large green section. As you can see, about 1/3 of our total budget is used for specific purposes as directed by state statute. So in other words, we cannot use designated funds for operating budget purposes. Now, the large blue section represents the operating fund, which supports core functions of the university. So that's things such as classroom instruction, student services, campus operations, and our state university grant program. And that's when we give you a budget update throughout the year, and we are in a way mandatorily required to give you an update 5 of your 6 board meetings. We're typically going to be talking to you on the budget about the operating budget. So that's that core instructional program that we operate as a university. So that's just want to give you that kind of a primer there too. So the next 2 slides that we'll go through will drill down further into the details of the operating fund budget for 21-22 for the current year. Now, again, the CSU's $7.4 billion operating budget represents the core functions of the university. And it has 3 primary funding sources. We have state general fund at 57%, tuition revenue at 34%, and about 9% for campus-based fees and other sources. Now, this pie chart shows the operating budget displayed by high-level expense category. So I just showed you the revenues. This is the expenditure side in a very high-level way. So you can see here salaries and benefits shown in the shades of green here make up about 72% of the total operating budget. State university grants, those are our institutional grant aid to students. That's shown in blue, and it makes up about 10% of the operating budget. This does not include approximately $2.3 billion in philanthropic, state, and federal grant aid. So this is strictly the university SUG program only. And then the remaining is made up of a variety of expenses, such as information technology, instructional equipment, supplies, contracts, utilities, debt service, insurance, and any other non-personnel expenditure of the university. All right, so that's it for just a primer on that. We're going to pivot now to take a look at our reserves and designated balances. So lastly, for your background purposes, is the latest information on our operating fund reserves and designated balances. So this slide shows year-end balances for the past 5 years, which shows a year-over-year improvement in one-time balances and reserves. The CSU has prudently managed reserves and designated balances to meet strategic goals, and one of which has been preparation for possible economic uncertainty. So in the first several months of the pandemic, the CSU drew upon these reserves on a one-time basis to maintain operations and programs impacted by COVID-19. More specifically, and early in the pandemic, the Chancellor's Office estimated that 45% of all operating fund reserves for economic uncertainties would be used in 2021 to cover COVID-related losses and expenses just in the operating fund alone. The fortunate reality, though, was that over the past 18 months, with subsequent rounds of federal legislation and appropriations to our campuses, they've been able to use one-time federal funds in lieu of those operating fund reserves for the COVID-related losses and costs. So that's been a real lifeline for our campuses to not be drawing down their reserves so significantly. That federal funding was very helpful to them. So because of that, we no longer anticipate, like we did last year, that there would be this measured use of reserves over a multi-year period. Instead, the economy and state budget have rebounded sooner than expected. So that's really great news going forward for our budget. But if you could please look and focus your attention on just the completed fiscal year. So that's the 2021 data to the far right over there. On June 30th of 2021, total reserves and balances in the operating fund totaled $2 billion. It's worth pointing out that reserves for economic uncertainty, that's that little light blue band there, those totaled $531 million. That is less than 1 month. It's about 27 days of operating fund costs. So our reserve policy, which we mentioned many times in the past, is that we recommend a minimum of 3 months or a minimum of about 90 days of reserves. And we're still working towards that goal, obviously. These one-time reserves are and will be available to campuses to help with revenue losses and unavoidable operating costs due to any future economic downturn. And the other 3 designated balance categories, such as catastrophic leave, used for capital needs, and short-term obligations, are for specific purposes and obligated not only in the current year, but for years to come. And that's what that darker blue section represents, the 3 of those.
Right, Ryan, so our rainy day fund is the $531 million.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. All right, moving on to the next slide. So because the 2021 budget for the CSU included the restoration of a budget cut and new investments, we must now consider the prospects of the state providing more investments in the 22-23 budget cycle. Now, the CSU's budget allocation is highly dependent on how well the state's economy is doing. And today, I'd like to say the forecast is fairly promising, actually pretty good. There are several positive economic indicators for that. So first, as you're aware, COVID-19 had a significant impact on the California economy. In May of 2020, the state estimated a $54 billion multi-year deficit. And fast forward to a year later, the state now estimates a $75 billion multi-year surplus. So that's an unprecedented, and I don't want to toss this word around lightly, but this truly is an unprecedented swing of fortunes for the state. Second, both the Department of Finance and the Legislative Analyst's Office expect continuous state tax revenue growth through 24-25. Now, the LAO's forecast of about 3% growth per year is a touch more optimistic than the Department of Finance's forecast of about 2% growth. Third, over the past decades, state general fund support for the CSU has increased nearly every year. Setting aside that $299 million reduction in 2021, that was subsequently restored this year, that decade of growth has helped with much needed predictability and sustainability. Fourth, for this slide, we have a year-over-year improvement in one-time balances and reserves, like we just walked through. And fifth, CSU campuses have federal one-time grants of $1.8 billion. And that's been since the start of the pandemic. That's to help cover pandemic costs and losses. And they've also received one-time investment opportunities and another $1.3 billion for student grant aid. So the bottom line is that the CSU is at a good fiscal starting point on recurring as well as one-time funding levels. So with the state budget looking promising in the short and longer term, the state is arguably in a position to invest more in the CSU. So we just covered a significant amount of background information with our goal being continued student success. There are several reasons why we should request new investments by the state for the upcoming year. So the first is there is a positive economic outlook in the short term and the longer term. Second, if the state budget were to continue to improve, we should have the university positioned for a potential investment. We all work very hard in building the case in Sacramento for the CSU. We must prepare and be prepared for when the finances and the priorities of the state align with the budget priorities of the university and the trustees. And third, as we weigh this information, our priorities for student success and the finances of the CSU and the state, it all points to a comprehensive budget, a request once again with an eye toward the long-term future of the CSU. All right. So this last slide here that I'm going to share with you is a preliminary plan for the 22-23 year. Remember, Steve at the beginning talked about us talking about this some ideas about what we should potentially include in our budget request to the state. At our next meeting in November, we'll be finalizing a recommendation to you, and you'll contemplate whether to approve that plan. So we really love your feedback after I walk through these items. Just get your feedback on what you think about what we have here. Just a little bit of housekeeping out of the gate. These estimates that we have here, they will be adjusted based on our conversation, and as well as additional information from our campuses that we are continuing to analyze. So I'll describe each of these categories on the slide, and I'll begin with Grad Initiative 2025. So it's our most important priority, and we are on the right path to improving student success. There's additional need for more faculty to provide courses and more advisors to counsel students. And these and other grad initiative strategies will provide students with greater access to courses they need, will continue to narrow that equity gap, and will foster greater student engagement and well-being. So this positive momentum that we've had over the years is at risk if this component is not funded. Therefore, funding for the initiative is more important than ever. And to continue to meet our targets, we recommend an incremental recurring investment of $75 million in the initiative again this year. So moving down to the next one, while the CSU's primary mission is educational in nature, the CSU recognizes that students cannot be fully engaged in or out of the classroom if they are preoccupied with hunger, with housing insecurity, and personal safety or mental health concerns. So we've just collected some information, and we have some preliminary fall 2021 survey data on basic needs. And campuses now are investing $138.9 million from all funding sources on basic needs support and services to students. That's a 50% increase over fall 2020 survey, which was about $92 million. Now, granted, some of that is due to the decisions made in the budget, where there was additional funding that was added for basic needs as well as student mental health. That's a significant increase year over year in this area. So this can help determine if additional funding, this information I'm sharing with you can help determine if additional funding should be included in that operating budget again this year. So as a placeholder, we have here the addition of $10 million to $20 million in recurring funds that would provide the CSU more opportunities to expand student basic needs. Now moving over to the next one, over the course of the past year, the CSU helped bridge the equity divide by increasing student access to critical technology to ensure that they have what they need to succeed in a virtual learning environment. In July 2021, the CSU announced the launch of the first phase of C-Success. It's a bold initiative to enhance student achievement and create more equitable opportunities for the CSU community to provide industry-leading technology. So all fall 2021 incoming first year and new transfer students on 8 of our campuses who registered to participate in the initiative were offered an iPad Air, Apple Pencil, Apple Smart Keyboard Folio. So students will be provided with this iPad bundle for the entirety of their undergraduate experience at the CSU. So next steps in bridging the equity divide through technology could be expanding C-Success in fall 2022 to more campuses and more students. Also, the request could expand information technology capabilities so that the educational experiences, our lessons learned through the pandemic, and opportunities identified there can be optimized now and in the future for course delivery. Additional information, technology infrastructure that expands research opportunities and campuses' access to advanced cyber infrastructure could be a component of this request. But at this early stage, Chancellor's Office staff estimate between $50 million and $100 million in new recurring costs if this is pursued. Moving on to employee salary and benefit increases, the Unit 3, which is our California Faculty Association contract, is currently open for negotiation. Most other collective bargaining agreements expire at the end of 21-22, and discussions between bargaining units and the Chancellor's Office are underway or will commence as early as this fall for successor agreements. So early estimates indicate that salary, healthcare premium, and pension cost increases for all employee groups will cost between $199 million and $245 million. This range includes an estimate of Unit 3 salary-only recurring costs for 21-22 and an estimate of all units, including Unit 3 salary and benefit costs, recurring costs for 22-23. So much work still needs to be done to improve academic facilities and core infrastructure on CSU campuses. Last November, the trustees approved a 5-year capital plan that identified $16.8 billion of academic facility and infrastructure needs. As a point of reference, since 2014, we have been able to address about $2 billion worth of necessary projects and about $650 million of one-time deferred maintenance. So there's still much more to do. So if we were to dedicate $50 million of new recurring funding in 22-23, we could finance about $750 million of projects. With $135 million, we could finance about $2 billion of projects that make needed improvements in campuses and create jobs in the 23 diverse regions of our state. A complementary strategy to that could be to include a one-time funding request between $500 million and $1 billion from the state to further address deferred maintenance needs of the university. Now on to enrollment growth. In 2015, the Public Policy Institute of California concluded that the state would fall about 1.1 million college graduates short of economic demand by 2030. New enrollment and persistent enrollment are key to closing the anticipated degree gap. Now, the PPIC today reports that California is currently on track to close the degree gap and attributes that success to increases in enrollment at CSU and UC, and to university programs such as the Graduation Initiative 2025 those have successfully improved student persistence and graduation rates. So to stay on track, there remains a need to regularly add more enrollment over the next several years so that by 2030, it would mean 480,000 more Californians with CSU degrees. It will also mean that we will have done our part in laying a strong foundation for California's future economy. To accommodate more students at the CSU, the legislature and governor committed to providing recurring funding to grow enrollment by 9,434 resident full-time equivalent students beginning in 22-23. Now, this would cost approximately $129 million and would be equivalent to about a 2.5% increase in funded enrollment growth, principally for new 2-year transfer and 4-year first-time student seats, and to a smaller extent, growth in the average unit load for continuing students in support of grad rate goals. Funding for this item would come from 2 sources. One part would be from the State General Fund, and additional tuition revenue would come from new students as well. And then going on to mandatory costs, inflation impacts all areas of the university. And for the most part, salary and benefit cost increases are addressed through collective bargaining and through state budgetary processes. However, over the past decade, the CSU operating budget request and the final state budget have not included funding explicitly dedicated to cost increases on a variety of expenses, such as technology, instructional equipment, supplies, contracts, those sorts of items. So these types of costs account for about 18% of the CSU operating budget and a significant portion of it. So other mandatory costs include increases to operations and maintenance of newly constructed facilities and other compensation-related costs, such as minimum wage law increases. So those are our mandatory costs. And then the final item for this slide, the Budget Act of 2021 included $2 million for the Chancellor's Office to evaluate the existing salary structure and issues of salary inversion and provide any recommendations for alternative salary models for CSU non-faculty staff. The Chancellor's Office, CSUEU, Teamsters, and SEIU partnered this past spring to advocate for state funding for this particular purpose. Now, our organizations have long desired to find a mutually agreeable solution to address issues of inversion and salary structure. This item is time dependent, okay? And potential costs will not be known for many months. And that is why we have a placeholder here, a TBD, so to speak, on potential costs. The evaluation that's because the evaluation will be completed by April 30th of next year. And that final report could include recommendations that could require additional funding. So the tentative plan is for the Chancellor's Office to continue partnering with these represented staff groups to advocate for additional funding in the spring and summer of 2022, just prior to the final enactment of the 22-23 state budget. So it'll be a really quick turnaround in that area. So if you agree with the strategy, this item could be included as a placeholder in our operating budget request. So altogether, the recurring portion of the budget request would be between $563 million and $754 million under this preliminary 22-23 plan. In addition, the one-time portion of the budget request would range from $500 million to $1 billion for deferred maintenance. So that wraps up my portion of the presentation, and Steve has some final comments.
Thank you, Ryan. So we hope this information will prove useful as we work together to develop the final operating budget request for the upcoming fiscal year. As you can see, it's a request that will promote the achievement of our students while recognizing the state's likely capacity to invest additional funding in the CSU. And it goes without saying that student success has been the critical focus of the university probably since its founding, but in 2015, with the launch of Graduation Initiative 2025, we've elevated student success to a different level, a higher level, and with that, a commitment to eliminate equity gaps while improving graduation rates. So from 2015 through 2019, we've had very measurable success, and you'll be hearing about the time period after that from Dr. Alva in the future. Closing the equity gaps continues, as you heard earlier today, to be a driving focus of the university. So our budget plan focuses on the success of our students, which we think is just imperative. It will take a strong CSU today and a solid alumni base tomorrow to ensure that we have a bright California for all. So Trustee McGrory, that concludes our presentation, and we're happy to collect feedback and address any questions.
Ryan, that's a very clear presentation. Thank you. Could you put the last chart back up so we can look at that as we're asking questions? I have a couple quick questions. This assumes no tuition increase, right?
Correct.
And the basic needs that were budgeted last year, what was the number on that? It was approved by the state?
Ryan, do you recall the number from last year?
Yes, our budget request included $30 million last year. And that, while it wasn't perfectly funded that way, it was split up. It was a total of $30 million was added for basic needs in general. 15 million of it was for basic needs, and then the other 15 million was split to support student mental health.
Is that one time, Ryan, or recurring?
Recurring.
So this 10 to 20 would be an add-on to that?
Yes.
Okay. And then the academic facilities number, can you put that up on the screen? It's up on the top, you guys, but it's not on the main screen. Can you move it, drag it down? No.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it on my screen.
Academic facilities and infrastructure, Jack?
Yeah.
It's there. It's right in the middle.
Academic facilities and infrastructure is budgeted 50 to 135, and you're assuming on that number, Steve, that you want to bond against that, so that would be a long-term commitment?
Yeah, so I'm glad you, Trustee McGrory, I'm glad you brought this up, because we're really talking at the same time about three strategies that are not mutually exclusive, but it's important to understand the difference. One strategy is what's shown right here on this chart, which is to ask the state to provide us a recurring amount of money for academic facilities infrastructure that would then serve the debt, right? So, and I think Ryan gave you the, depending on whether you pick 50 or 135, you're talking about either about $750 million of new, of facility and infrastructure that's financed by that, or at the 135 recurring amount, that would serve debt on about $2 billion worth of facility. So in a sense, you could view that 135 as a replacement of or instead of a GO bond for $2 billion. In this case, the debt service would be built into our operating budget, gives us a lot more flexibility. We can jump on it quickly. On the other hand, it doesn't necessarily mean we should abandon the idea of the GO bond, that, if it turns out that the polling numbers are good, if we have a partnership with UC, a strong partnership with UC, we're able to find the resources to do the appropriate communication strategy on it and all those other things, we may want to consider doing that in parallel with this strategy. And then the final third piece of this that Ryan talked about earlier is, in addition to this, what often will happen in the 11th hour of the budget process, as we get to the end of May and early June, is oftentimes the state will say, well, gee, we just don't have the recurring dollars to do what you want to do. Would you accept a lump sum, of one-time dollars to address your most critical facility needs? And of course, we want to be open to that as well. So we're really talking about kind of three potentially parallel tracks.
The downside of that is that commitment from the legislature is not bulletproof. I mean,
That's right. And I think that's a bit of the downside of the GO bond, is that, the assumption is that once it gets, voted, that it will be a clear add-on to the CSU budget, but that's not a slam dunk.
Yeah. Then my last issue is the legislature funded the study of the staff salaries, but we are not studying the faculty salaries. Is that right?
That's correct. And, it could be that Nicole or Evelyn might have more background on the genesis of that, but it is very much targeted to what we know are pretty significant problems with inversion and compression with staff salaries.
I think you have a similar issue. I know we're in bargaining, but my experience is we also have serious issues with faculty salaries that I think if you don't look at faculty at the same time you're looking at staff, you're not getting the full picture. So I would advocate for including faculty somehow and us figuring out the funding for that study.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that. Ryan, I don't recall the exact statutory language of the funds that are dedicated to this study, but I think it was pretty much directed at staff, but we can look at.
It's specifically for staff.
So if we want to do faculty, we'd have to come up with the money on our own.
Yeah, or wait for the next budget cycle.
I'd rather do it sooner than later, but okay, Trustee Reynes.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to first say thank you to EVC Relier and ABC Storm for always answering my questions and everybody's questions, and especially making finance vocabulary so easy to understand. That's a really big thing for me. I'm not a finance major, so thank you. I first had a clarifying question, and then I'll get into my comments about the proposed allocations. So in regards to basic needs, I see the 10 mil to 20 million range. Is that going to be in addition to 15 million? So that would be a total of perhaps 25 million or 35 million?
So yeah, the 10 to 20 here, what happened last year, which was very fortunate for us, is that, and Trustee Range, you probably recall that in prior years, and I'm not talking about the year that we're in right now, but in prior years, we were successful at getting some one-time money for basic needs. But this past year, for this current year's budget, we were able to get recurring money. And that was, I think, the first time we've gotten it that way, which is great, because then, of course, that means every year we'll get that recurring allocation. So what we're bringing up here is in addition to that base building recurring allocation that we got approved for this year, that on top of that, we build another $10 to $20 million in for basic needs, which also would be recurring. So you're right, it would sit right on top of that.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that. I do have a few comments. I want to preface this by saying that I attended CSSA's last plenary, and they're currently doing a policy draft agenda of all of their priorities. And I believe they have about 17 priorities. And I wanted to highlight a few, one being mental health. Specifically, a lot of students have come to CSSA and come to trustees as well as just our friends saying that there is a cap currently on a lot of campuses for counseling sessions that needs to be increased or perhaps lifted. And I know there's a cap because of the lack of counseling. And so if it's 6, and it also varies through campus. So some campuses have 6, some campuses have 10, and it should be more, as many as possible, or at least a high number. I also wanted to highlight that in mental health, we need more counselors in general, period. There's a really big staffing issue across the board with campuses, some being better, but still under that ratio that we do need for making sure that students are healthy mentally. Secondly, I really wanted to highlight tech. So I see CSU Success as one of the programs to implement and hopefully further go to implement on to more campuses. I was wondering if we could include hotspots in that as well, because I know internet access is a really big issue for our students, as well as, I'm not sure if Trustee Sebelius is going to mention this. I know he mentioned it last year. Tech training for our faculty is so important and it trickles down into their teaching and how students experience the virtual classroom, which we're going to be moving more and more into in the future. As well as a side note, when we talk about C Success, once the program, it's already being implemented in so many campuses, but we need to highlight that students who especially come from low income backgrounds, they pretty much have a package for when they get into college. They get technology, they get Pell Grant or Cal Grant or State University Grant, and their education is covered. As they just have to get a job to make sure that they make ends meet with regards to the actual full cost of attendance. But it's really important that we emphasize to our new students, transfer students, and first-time freshmen that we have the materials. So I wanted to make that point as well. The final point that I wanted to make was falling under the facilities and infrastructure and a little bit into catastrophic events. I know that's not really a part of the budget itself, but I wanted to highlight a few concerns. So Chico, Humboldt, and Sonoma are all in fire counties. They're either currently in smoke right now or they are threatened of being on fire. I know Sonoma's they had to evacuate their dorms one year because it was on fire. And so I know Humboldt is going to be our next polytechnic, the gem of the North, pretty soon. And I'm worried that if we don't invest in these 3 campuses, especially Humboldt's infrastructure, that we could lose them very easily to fires because of climate change is accelerating, especially in Northern California and Oregon area. So I would like to see some investment in updating their facilities, updating fire-resistant facilities, because it's going to be 2-3 years that we're going to see evacuation from any of these campuses or a significant fire threat to any of these campuses. So those are my comments. I want to thank you again for you both being amazing, always answering questions and being so accessible to us.
Trustee Raines, thank you so much for your very thoughtful suggestions and comments. Let me just make a few comments, then I'll see if Ryan wants to add anything. I'll start with the last one that you mentioned, which is those campuses that are in those fire zones. You're absolutely right, and we've spent a lot of time, Vi San Juan's team and Robert Eaton's team, who are on the financing side, in modifying our capital plans to build in what we're, for lack of a better term, calling resiliency for those campuses that are in areas that are either prone to being in a fire danger or in danger of losing power for extended periods of times. And of course, those things go together, right? Sometimes when the winds are high. And so you're absolutely right that the campuses you identified are typical of those campuses who have a danger in that area. And so we're working very closely with campuses to look at utility systems and look at how they get water to them and other things that make them more resilient in a potentially hazardous atmosphere, right? Given how climate change seems to have continued to push us, closer to pretty dangerous situations in some of these communities. So that is very much a key input now in our capital program, and I appreciate you recognizing that and bringing that up. You also mentioned on another topic, CSSA's priorities, and we've the chancellor and the other vice chancellors and I have met with CSSA, and they've been kind enough to review that document with us and go through each of those sections. I think they have about 6 different sections, and you're right. And then there's quite a few priorities and actions with each of those. And the nice thing is, I think that a lot of what you see in this budget plan mirrors their priorities. So things like mental health and basic needs and that type of stuff. And so we will continue to work with CSSA to ensure that we bake those priorities into our plans. And of course, the advocacy part of this is going to be absolutely critical when we get to that part of the budget process. So thank you for mentioning that. And then one other comment I'll make, and that has to do with the technology comments that you were making. We're really happy with the way that C-Success has rolled out and the way it's been received by the students and the impact it's made. This was our first year in a very bold vision that the chancellor had for getting technology into the hands of the people that need it most is really a key strategy in dealing with equity gaps and, of course, in improving our graduation rates. So we're very happy. It's, we started it with those 8 campuses. One of the things that was a help was that the fact that we were getting some money from the federal government to address COVID-related expenses and revenue losses. And this clearly fit into the category of COVID-related expenses. So that was a nice booster shot for us, probably the wrong metaphor, but it really helped a lot. And so that's why we're asking for this money in the budget, is that given the success and given our desire and CSSA's desire and students' desire to expand the opportunities here, is to get some money to follow on and build on that. The other thing is, you mentioned hotspots, and that's something we're very interested in. We have been working with Superintendent Tony Thurman's office, he's very interested in this as well, in finding ways of getting those students in need absolute, very low cost for unlimited hotspots. And we're talking about, roughly, say, $10 a month for hotspots and unlimited access to data and all that. So Mike Berman, who's the CIO for the CSU system, is working on that with the campus CIOs and with folks in Sacramento. So we're hopeful we're going to have something to roll out there. So with that, Ryan, was there anything you want to add or correct me on? All right. Trustee Raines, again, thanks for those thoughtful questions.
Trustee Steinhauser.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I would concur with Trustee Raines' commendation, Steve and Ryan, of your department. And my comments are an add-on. So I had a conversation with Dr. Alva about a week ago about looking at some new ideas of how our system can partner with superintendent, the governor's office, and the Department of Finance. And as for those who don't know, once the budget is developed, 40% of it has to go to basically K-12, K-14. And so, as we've known in the past, when it's a good budget like we're talking about, they tend to give one-time resources because they don't want ongoing costs for future years. So I would ask us to give thought of looking for our partnership with our K-12 partners around how we accelerate the closure of the achievement gap and the equity gaps under our graduation initiative 2025. You know, for example, we can look at accelerating dual enrollment. We can look at having new programs accelerate with in advanced manufacturing. These are all economic issues. With new programs that we have at Humboldt State regarding data science, there's ways that we can accelerate this for the young people as well as the future workforce. There's a huge teacher shortage in the nation, and California is experiencing it right now. If you go to any K-12 district, there's huge shortages of teachers and counselors and so on. So I would ask us not to take away from our ask, but to have another add-on with our partners and how we can accelerate the economic engine of this state.
Trustee Steinhaus, thank you very much for those great comments. And you're absolutely right. And I know that Dr. Alva has a keen interest in partnering with K through 12. You know, we often hear of the issues in K through 12 about having students college ready and them trying a lot of different investments and strategies to improve the college readiness of graduates out of K through 12. Obviously, that feeds right into the graduation initiative and very much impacts it. And as you know well from your career, that is a pretty significant investment that the state by statute now has to make into K through 12. And to the extent that we can partner and leverage that investment to help both K through 12 and the university really makes sense. And I know Dr. Alva is going to be very interested in doing that as well.
Sure. Trustee Sebelius.
I am very pleased to see a bold and robust budget request, especially in regards to facilities and deferred maintenance. I particularly like the two-pronged or three-pronged approach in requesting both recurring funds to leverage them for bonds and one-time funds, and as well as to continue to pursue a voter referendum for our facilities. There is, however, one item I like to see increased, and that is, it might not come as a surprise to you, the item on employee salary and benefit increases. Currently, you plan to ask for about $200 to $250 million. I round up the numbers. I know that to provide a salary increase of 1% will cost the system $46 million. Based on that number, the amount that you're currently requesting or proposing that the trustees request would equate to a 4 to 5% increase. But that does not sound too bad. However, these would not mean that the salary increases would be that high, because that number needs to cover increases in the cost for benefits as well. And you know, over the past year and also in the current year, the faculty, and you have acknowledged this, has done a tremendous work. And they all do have extra work because, you know, the switch from in-person classes to online and also to switch back or continuing certain classes in online or in hybrid form requires an extra amount of work that the faculty didn't have in regular years when they were simply improving their courses, and there were little adjustments necessary from year to year. So there's a tremendous amount of work that the faculty has put in, extra work. And the faculty did and does receive plenty of compliments from the administrators, from the chancellor's office, and from the board. We heard them even today from the chancellor and from our chair. And there's a lot of verbal acknowledgement of the lift, the fantastic work that the faculty has done. And I would like to see, in addition to the lip service, concrete rewards, appropriate rewards. And therefore, I urge the Chancellor's Office and the board to request a higher amount than the one you have currently suggested?
Trustee Sebelius, thank you very much for your very thoughtful suggestion regarding salaries. Yeah, this is of course the big item in the budget, and but it's important. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the faculty have done remarkable work. I mean, they do remarkable work anyway, but particularly during the pandemic, where so many had to pivot on a dime with very little resources and sometimes not a lot of training and not infrastructure to support them to deliver classes in that new mode. And now we're very much faced with having a much more ambiguous situation where it's not clear. We're clearly not 100% in person and not 100% online, but in a hybrid mode that's going to evolve depending on what occurs in the areas around our campuses. So we're asking a lot of the faculty. They've done an outstanding job, and also the staff. I mean, the staff have been also terrific, and we've asked so much of the staff to go above and beyond the call of duty to keep this university humming and getting our students the education and the support that they need. So anything we can do to keep our compensation competitive for faculty and staff, we're going to try to do. Just the numbers at some point get large enough where you are not probably going to get everything that you need. But I think your points are very well taken, that whatever we can do to bring salaries up and fairly compensate faculty and staff makes sense.
I agree, Romy. I think this should be a priority item in the budget, so we're going to have to work on it. Trustee Linares.
Thank you, Chair. EVC Rollier, thank you so much for the presentation. We haven't had the pleasure to meet the new trustee, and I have had the pleasure to meet ABC Storm. He walked me through the Finance Committee agenda. So thank you both so much for all the work you do. I actually wanted to talk to you about the recommitment that was asked of the CSU earlier in an earlier presentation in the Educational Policy Committee. So I worry about the 10 million that we are asking for. And the reason why I say that is because we're not really providing students with what they need. At that point, we're providing the bare minimum that a student needs to thrive. I do love the idea of helping students graduate in 4 years to save them money, right? Save them money on the loans that they take out, and then they end up in debt. I'm one of the students that has taken out loans. But I also want to encourage our students to be a proud CSU graduate. So it's not just about graduating students in 4 years, but preparing them for the workforce, and also graduating students who are proud to be a CSU graduate. I did want to ask you a quick question before I move on. Because I'm looking at online on kelsey.edu, an old presentation that was provided on how we're implementing change. What exactly constitutes student engagement and well-being?
In other words, the components of student engagement and well-being. I'm going to ask Ryan, because he has a better memory than I do, as to what that included.
Well, I probably need to defer to my colleagues in academic and student affairs, because this is one of the 6 components of Graduation Initiative 2025. From our vantage point in business and finance, which Steve and I are part of, when we're building the budget, we're building what you see here on our presentation, the basic needs line item. That is essentially is a dovetailing in with that component of student engagement and well-being over there on Grad Initiative 2025. Also embedded in the overarching program is student engagement and well-being. So over time, we've dedicated many millions of dollars to the Grad Initiative. Campuses have used that money to implement a whole bunch of student engagement and well-being items. Now, am I being specific enough probably for you? No, but there's hundreds, if not thousands, of ways in which that is occurring. I think of food pantries. I think of peer mentoring. I think of student mental health. I think of all of the battery of micro grants to students when there's that $100 or $200 needed to make rent or whatever the case is. There are a myriad of other items I think that are included in there, but that's, I think, how we dovetail in with that initiative is requesting in our budget request not only global money for grad initiative, but also some potential, some further earmarking, so to speak, for basic needs. I don't know if that was helpful or not.
It was. And I know it's such a huge umbrella, right? It's really hard to cover everything. I know that I'm one of the trustees that does want to recommit to GI 2025. And I think it's so important to support our students. I'm a student myself, of course. So there are a couple of things that were brought up earlier in public comment. And I know they've been brought up in the past, although I wasn't a trustee before. I have been watching Board of Trustees meetings since spring 2018, just because I was interested in knowing what was happening across the CSU as an advocate and activist, a student leader in ASI for the past 3 years. And so one of the things that was brought up was support for in-house student parents. I know that our student parents are falling through the cracks. I'm a student parent myself, 3 children at home, and it's really hard to get through school when our basic needs are not met, especially when we have children to worry about. Support for survivors of sexual assault, that wasn't necessarily part of the public comment. But I did do some research over the weekend across the CSU, just different pages that have been created for students to get their voices out, because they feel that when they've gone to Title IX office, the Title IX office at their campus, they were traumatized by the experience. And so that's another thing that I feel may be preventing students from graduating within the 4 years, which is our goal. And then lastly, students who have experienced discrimination or have been racially profiled. That is something very traumatic as well. And so that kind of falls under mental health, which my co-trustee Reynes mentioned earlier. So I really would encourage us to reconsider basic needs and perhaps ask for more money to be able to really recommit to the GI 2025 and be able to graduate students in 4 years like we want to do.
Trustee Linares, these are really good comments, and I really appreciate your thoughtful comments, and we will build that into our discussions as we go to the next stage of this budget. The other thing that you mentioned a little earlier was kind of preparing our students for the workforce, right? And this is something where, in addition to the priorities of CSSA and our students and our institution, there's a lot of interest by the state in that as well, for obvious reasons, right? I mean, it's the state economy that is going to be benefited the most by us being able to prepare students for the workforce and get our students graduated and gainfully employed. The state of California is a huge benefactor of that. So I think you're absolutely right. This is something where everyone wins if we're able to be successful with it. Last thing I'll say is your comments are very on point, I think, with regard to basic needs and mental health resources. One of the things that Ryan had talked about early in the presentation is that the 23 presidents, in addition to using the money that we're able to get from the state to invest in these areas, are taking money from elsewhere on the campuses and adding to that. So they're kind of multiplying the investment of the state by being able to, where they can, add additional mental health counselors and additional student support folks and additional facilities for things like food pantries. So Ryan, I think, showed that the increase in the overall investment was, forgot the number, Ryan, but it was, I think, about a 50% increase from last year compared to the year before.
That's
so
right.
This is something, when I visit the campuses, I hear a lot from the presidents that they are basically saying the same thing that you're saying, that we need to invest more in this area, and it's absolutely critical to the graduation initiative.
Thank you both. I appreciate you so much. And I really hope in the future, when we see the next presentation, that basic needs has a higher number in our budget.
Thank you, Trustee Linares. Appreciate that.
Trustee Linares. Trustee Fong.
Thank you, Chair McGrory. And thank you so much, EVC Relier and ABC Storm. terrific work on the budget. I know how challenging it has been over the years, and it's so wonderful to see this bold, rich budget that you've presented to us. I was happy to see the increases in basic needs, and I agree with Trustee Reynes on the mental health increases, if we could really raise that. I agree with the strategy for the staff salary structure study. And as been mentioned before, it's important for us to also have a study on faculty salaries. And I've had conversations with Vice Chancellor Nazario, and Evelyn, I didn't know if you wanted to, make a comment about that right now, but I do have some other comments.
Evelyn, would you like to address the faculty salaries studies?
Yes, I would, but I sort of would like to give a little bit of a context to how we got here with this current salary survey that we're going to be doing with CSUEU. So Trustee Fong, I don't know if you want to go ahead because mine is going to be just a little bit longer and I could, okay.
Great. So talking about the reserves set aside for economic uncertainty, we have less than, as Ryan had said, 27 days of expenses designated. Well below the need to maintain 3 to 6 months of operating expenses. So what is the thought about increasing that?
Yeah, it's thank you for that comment, Trustee Fong. It's something we pay a lot of attention to. And as Ryan was indicating earlier, we were very much prepared, a year ago. We really thought our reserves would be pretty far down this year because what was occurring on the campuses as a result of the pandemic, and particularly the way that the pandemic has affected self-funded enterprises like housing and parking. If you don't have students housed on a campus and you have no one parking on campus, there's no revenue. And that's where the reserves were very valuable to come in and help us. As you know, we also took a hit of about $300 million last year to our budget, and that's where the reserves are helpful. One of the things that's helped us a lot, of course, is the higher education emergency funding provided by the federal government. And that was able to come in and replenish those reserves. And that's an allowable expense as long as what you were using the reserves for was related to the pandemic, both on the expense side and on the revenue side. So that resulted in that chart looking the way it did that Ryan presented, where instead of the reserves going down, they actually have gone up. And we'd like to continue to do that. Now, how long will it take us to get to that 3-month benchmark that you mentioned? It'll take a very long time because, as you can see, we're gradually adding to our reserves, but we'll not get there quickly, but I think we will continue to get additional reserves and have additional liquidity over time if we keep managing the way that we're managing. One other benchmark, and the 3 to 6 month target is a kind of a rule of thumb that is typically used for universities and nonprofits and others. Some of you may have been maybe on other boards where you've maybe heard a similar kind of target for reserves, and that's where we get that from. One of the key, I think, indicators of kind of the health of the reserves at this stage is we meet on an ongoing basis with our rating agencies, right? So Moody's, Standard & Poor's, every time where Robert Eaton goes out to sell bonds to build buildings or fix buildings, we have to kind of prove that our reserves are one of many different indicators that our reserves are in good shape, that we have appropriate liquidity, that if some disaster happens, that we can recover from that. And what's helped us a lot is where we are right now with reserves. The rating agencies think we're in a good spot. And you can see that by what's occurred both in the market. This last about a month ago, Robert Eaton went out for about $2 billion in selling bonds, and it was our highest sale and the lowest financing we've gotten in the history of the CSU. In addition to that, we were able to restructure existing debt on things like housing and parking to the tune of a savings of about $83 million, which went directly to the campuses, to those operations to actually lower their costs, which of course in a pandemic is something that you want to do. So we've got a number of indicators that show that we're in pretty decent shape, I think, now with liquidity and with reserves. Can we be better? You're absolutely right. We can. And we should continue to keep that 3-month benchmark there and march towards it. I think if we can continue to build on that, we're just going to be in better shape. We'll be more resilient if unforeseen things happen. One other thing I'll mention is this was an example, probably one of the worst experiences was before your and my time with the CSU was, of course, the horrible recession that we had in 2008, where roughly $1 billion was just yanked out of the CSU budget, which was just huge. But what that showed, and it showed the rating agencies and the markets, is that in addition to a reserve position being healthy, the management of the university took very swift action to restructure our costs and other things to mitigate the impact on the university's operations. And so we always have to remember that's part of the strategy too, is to be ready and nimble to change the way we do business to fit those circumstances. So thank you for that. That's really, you're really speaking to my heart when you talk about reserves, because as a CFO, I really pay a lot of attention to them. And I think we're in decent shape, but you're absolutely right. We need to continue to increase them, and we'll hopefully do that each year.
Thank you so much for that update, Stephen, and the reasoning, and also just so wonderful to hear about our bond sales and our ratings. I mean, that's fantastic. And then finally, is there any type of update on the multi-year funding that we've been talking about for some time?
I have an update, but it's not, I guess, positive news at this stage. I guess I would call it more neutral news. But we've had, and thanks, Trustee Fong, for that question, because we have actually put quite a lot of time in talking to folks in Sacramento about this multi-year plan. And, I'll be just very blunt. I mean, one of the sticking points here is simply, yes, let's talk about a multi-year of, I'll put in parentheses, guaranteed funding for CSU. And I put it in parentheses because it's not really guaranteed. It's a concept that probably would go out the window with the first recession, right? But we've had those discussions. Unfortunately, what we've not been able to come to agreement on is what would be the level of that funding. So if the promise is that we'll give you funding at, say, a 2% a year, and you're going to be locked into a 2% increase each year. Well, all you have to do is take a look at where have we gone in the last 10 years? What has been the increment to our budget? Well, it's been quite a bit more than that. And it's not been frivolous. As you've seen, we've made important investments in the grad initiative, in increasing access to the university, in basic needs, and all the other things. And it's never enough, but it's always been quite a bit more than what the state would like in a multi-year agreement. They would like to actually squish that down to a smaller amount. So then the question becomes, is how important is predictability versus the actual amount of money you actually get to run the institution? And from my point of view, I'd rather have the resources to run the institution than have kind of a predictable budget cut, essentially, because, with that level of funding, you're not going to do much with regard to salaries, and you're not going to do much with regard to improving access and, funding things like the grad initiative. So for now, I don't want to say that this is a work in progress. Let's just put it that way, that we just need to continue to express to the state the value of the university, and that these kind of investments are important. Something that Trustee Steinhauser said earlier is very important to this whole conversation, and that is that the state, in looking forward and not knowing the future either, is going to want to minimize any kind of recurring obligations in out years. And they'll be okay with, some one-time obligations, but recurring, they tend to want to stay away from that when they look at their own forecasts of economic growth over the next few years.
Well, the good news was at least there was a discussion about it, Steve, this year. The bad news was
Yeah, we had many discussions, and well, I'm hoping we'll have many more, because I just think that the CSU has a very good story, and we can. I mean, as you know, we have studies that show that you invest $1 in the CSU's budget, and we will produce about between $5 and $6 of economic activity and growth for the state of California.
Thank you, Trustee Fong. Trustee Fagan.
Steve, we all want and recognize the need for infrastructure improvements and maintenance. My concern is that 50 to 135 million a year locks that in. And I wanted to see how comfortable you are with having to service that debt down the road, if and when, and it will be when, things kind of head south. As you mentioned, the 2008 recession, we were able to live with $1 billion cut, but if I recall hearing correctly, it involved a lot of personal pain and institutional pain in being able to make up those cuts, including faculty salary problems and tuition increase. So how do you react to that? What's your plan, and how comfortable are you with committing to these kinds of increased debt payments?
Trustee Fagan, thank you for that question. I'd swear you're a finance guy in disguise, because you always have good questions like this. And they're the kind of things that people like Ryan Storm and Robert Eaton and I think about a lot is, what is the right amount of, fixed obligations like this when you compare it to your budget? And I think as we look at kind of the ratios of where you should be on these kind of obligations, that we're comfortable with this level. If we just as an alternative decided not to do this and go out for a GO bond, we'd kind of be in the same predicament. We'd be in the same predicament of having an obligation of debt that you could not cut when you had say a recession or a budget reduction. So the question is you're right. It's a question of balance. How much are you willing to take on, knowing that? Now, from our perspective, the beauty, if it gets funded, and that's a big if, but if it gets funded, so let's say at that 135 level, which is at the higher end of the range, you're going to be able to invest in about $2 billion of critical projects. And of course, we have more than $2 billion for critical projects, but we can get to the real important stuff with that. And it would be new money that, you're right, it wouldn't be available for a future budget cut, but at least it's new incremental money. We're not taking it out of current operations. It's adding to it. And if you look at, and again, this is where rating agencies come into the picture. When they look at all the ratios of how much debt you have compared to your operations, we're in the kind of shape we think we should be in. Now, what is one of the let's say telltale benchmarks to show you're maybe getting out of whack, or maybe you're extending yourself too much? One would be, at some point, the rating agencies would say, you know what, rather than being at this rate, we're going to notch you down one, or notch you down half of a step or something like that. That's showing that maybe your ratios, they're not unhealthy, but they're a little more extended than they have been. And that hasn't happened yet. And it's not that we don't necessarily want it to. We may at some point make a conscious decision that we want to increase debt to the point where we actually do lower those ratings slightly. That won't really affect much in the way of interest rates, but will give us a lot more debt capacity. So you're asking the right question. That's the bottom line. And maybe I'm spending too much time answering it, but it's a really good question. But we feel pretty confident at that level, given the need that we have, and given how expensive it is to maintain buildings that are built in the 50s and the 60s, and the bite it takes out of our operating budget. We'd rather, commit that debt, particularly if it's new dollars coming in that are going to be baked into our base budget, commit that to serving the debt and building these buildings.
So the bottom line of that then is that even if we were into a recession and inflation and all those bad things, this amount is not going to be so overwhelming that you're going to have to see kind of draconian cuts in our operations and affect faculty salaries and tuition and all those things. We'll still be able to get along pretty well.
Well, you know, I guess the way I would look at it is if you're having your budget augmented with this amount to serve that debt, then some big budgetary disaster happens in California, you're going to have to tighten belts. You're going to have to take some of the steps that we've taken in the past to do that. And whether you have that additional amount of money for the debt or not, you're going to have to pretty much do the same thing, right? You're going to have to still tighten your belts either way, whether you have the incremental money to serve the debt or whether you don't have the incremental money to serve the debt. So that's why I think we're comfortable with it. So yeah, I think it's a worthwhile investment. Really quick, and I know I'm going a little too long on this, but two other factors in addition to the cost of money and the cost of debt is what's going on with the cost of construction right now and how much is money costing us. Right now, you know, we've been very fortunate to bring in the cost of capital at the lowest point in our history. So we're getting really great rates in the market. On the other hand, the cost of construction continues to escalate much faster than a lot of other things. And so my point of view is the quicker we're able to address facilities issues and take advantage of today's construction rates at today's cost of money, we're going to be better off.
Okay. Thank you, Trustee Fagan. Evelyn Nazario?
Thank you, Trustee McGrory. And I wasn't quick enough with getting myself off mute the last time, so that's why I had to raise my hand. But I thought it was important for me to basically comment and chime in on your comment, Trustee McGrory, and also Trustee Fong's, when it comes to faculty issues that we are having with faculty pay. So to give a little bit of context as to how we got here with CSUEU, we agree that we do have issues with compression, with equity, with inversion, not just with faculty, not just with staff, with all, and even our administrators, with our management personnel plan employees. And we know we do need to address this. However, that said, it is very costly and don't have that in our current budget. Well, we may have some reserves, but reserves are one-time funds, and we would need to have this in base budget. So how did we get here? How we got here was we've had a really great opportunity to really partner with CSUEU. And we started partnering with them pretty much when COVID hit. They were very open to meeting with us almost on a weekly basis to really start talking and really start addressing issues that we have. And I want to say that I have to give the credit here to actually Catherine Hutchinson, who's the CSUEU president, to Charles Toombs, but to the CSUEU president and to Jim Filio, who's their director, who were absolutely very open and wanting to change our interactions and how we work with one another and to really be a lot more collaborative. So that said, an opportunity arose in which there was an opportunity to get some money from the legislatures on a project. And CSUEU reached out and we agreed that it would be great for us to be able to work together, and that we did. And we both agree that we need to deal with inversion, we need to deal with compression, but we also agree that we know that we didn't have that in our budget. And it would be great for us to be able to see if we can get some money to get an outside consultant to identify the problem. And that's how we got to that point. So much so that they also are involved in the process. They actually, to be totally transparent, they were part of developing the scope when we went out for the request for proposal. And they are part of the committee in choosing the vendor that we're going to wind up going with. So again, this is a true partnership. And I think this is why we were able to do what we did. That said, we will be going out with also a faculty survey. We're committed to doing that. But as like with CSUEU, when we get the findings, we know very well that within our budget, we're not going to have that kind of money. It's going to be quite a large sum of money. And it's going to take for us to have to go to our legislatures to request some money. CSUEU is very well aware of that. And we are committed together come April, the end of April, come May, to basically band together and go as a united front to say, we really want to do this. We need to do this for their members, our employees. And I don't want to exclude CFA at all. Our faculty, they've done a phenomenal job. They are, educate our students, right? That's what we're here for. But I also need to explain and understand that this is something that we can't do with our current budget. We do have to ask for money for this. The money that we get, whether it's a 2% increase or 3% increase, barely covers cost of living. And we know that, especially now with prices that are going up the way they are. But I feel that if we can work together hand in hand, we can get there, just like we did with CSUU in being able to get this $2 million to do this survey. And hopefully once this is done, we'll be able to get some kind of funding to do something with our staff. But faculty is not being overlooked whatsoever. We acknowledge them. We acknowledge there's a lag. We acknowledge we need to do something with them. The question is going to be is, how do we do it? Because how do we get the money to do it?
Well, I just think we need to treat them similarly. And that we need to get a survey done. Find out.
Absolutely. And we have reached out to them to meet with them more on a regular basis to be able to have these types of dialogue. And we'll continue to do so. And even if we don't have those meetings, we'll continue to march forward just like we are doing with the survey that we have, that we're putting out. So I don't disagree. And I felt it was very important for you to know that they are just as important as everyone else, including staff.
Yeah. Trustee Lopez.
Thank you. And thank you, Steve Relier and your staff for all the work that you do, and especially the way you've managed the affairs of the school financially, because I think it's of the system financially, because I think it's been a challenging 10 years or more, to say the least. I'm new, so I haven't really had a chance to study all the details and have enough information to make specific comments, but I thought it was important to just look contextually at what we're looking here. And then I'll get to my concern, which is a long-term concern. It's not about this year's budget, but it's this. By my calculation, we are asking for a budget incremental increase of anywhere between 7 and close to 10%, not including the very necessary staff and possibly faculty adjustments that may be coming down. So we are talking about a substantial incremental potential increase that we're talking about. And that gets me to thinking about longer term sustainability of these kinds of jumps year in and year out. And the reason it gets me to thinking about that is that the general fund doesn't grow at that pace. You may have great state economic growth, but it doesn't translate into general fund growth. And it's one of the reasons that Sacramento will only offer 2% or 3%. The general fund grows at around, and is projected over time to grow at roughly 5% a year for the entire state, the general fund. And so that's where the trade-offs come in, and they become serious fights in Sacramento, even in good times. I mean, this year was extraordinary for a whole different reason. I don't think we'll ever, in my lifetime anyway, see another year like this. But going forward, the concern I have, and this is what's happened traditionally with higher ed financing, is when the general fund doesn't grow and the state does its budget, and they will meet as much of the needs of the of CUC and CSU as they can get, and there's still a hole. That's where they expect and sort of say, well, you've got tuition. You can increase tuition. And my long-term concern on sustainability is that if we also, besides equity and student success and all those things, we care about affordability, we need to start thinking longer term about the implications of these budgets on tuition, because the state is not always going to be there to make up these differences. And I think we should prepare ourselves, and at the very least, if I'm a Cassandra here, apologies for my maiden voyage into this board, but I'd like to be prepared And I think we at least ought to run some longer term scenarios on that sustainability and literally what it means in terms of potential funding in the longer term, given longer term projections for the general fund. And so that's my worry, longer term. So Chancellor Castro, Steve, I would just offer that as a suggestion, not about this budget, but that as we go forward, because they're very meritorious requests here. And I too am concerned about faculty and staff salaries and inequities. And I think that that's something that really deserves the attention of this board and priority of this board. But at some point, increases of 10 or more % are not sustainable in the state of California's overall public financing structure as it exists right now. Sorry about that.
No, Trustee Lopez, don't be sorry, because what you're saying is exactly correct. And first of all, I want to just say how great it is for me to see you on this board and how much I've been a fan of you and the College Futures Foundation and the work you've done on behalf of public higher education over the years. So you have a really good understanding of the dynamics with the state budget and how it can impact the university, and appreciate all the advocacy you've done for us in the past. And so it's great to have you on the board. And you've just demonstrated, how valuable your expertise is to this. It is definitely a problem that, as we put together a very bold ask like this, we should not expect that we're going to get this fully funded. I mean, I think this is the tricky part of this exercise is that we've tried in some past years to try to gauge our ask to what we think the state might have available to it. And sometimes we've been right and sometimes we've been wrong. And as we've seen, the state's own ability to forecast its revenues just 6 months in the future, 12 months in the future have been dramatically in the wrong direction. So you're right about the long-term sustainability. We might have to, consider, I know we don't like to talk about tuition, but we've gone for many, many years without tuition increases. And we like it that way. We like to keep costs down and access up. And we like to always say that of all of our contemporaries, our peer institutions in the country, that our tuition is the lowest. But that is one piece of this is how you might factor that into some modeling in the future. But I think, what we've decided to do is really, at least in the short term, is ask for what we need as opposed to ask for what we think the state is going to give us. It's a tricky thing to do because we know that the likelihood that we're going to get what we're asking for, particularly over the long term, is extremely small. But at least we're putting out there from a very honest, standpoint that to really run the institution correctly, this is what we need. But you're right. It's not going to, in the future, it's going to have to come from a lot of sources. Obviously, tuition is nearly about 45% of our operating budget. That's an important area. And then we've been, investing a lot in partnerships with third parties and others to try to bring in funding that we haven't received in the past. But your comments are right on target, and I greatly appreciate them.
Yeah, the problem, I think, with our strategy, I think Trustee Lopez said it, the more, as we freeze tuition, which we've basically done for 9 or 10 years, to grow the CSU, we've had to become more and more reliant on the state of California. And we're not as independent as we used to be because of that. And that's the problem with that. And that's why I think you're right. Entrepreneurial opportunities, corporate partnerships, getting sponsorships, just doing a lot more on the entrepreneurial side will help. But these numbers are so large in terms of the request for the state that we just every year become more reliant on the state of California, and that's difficult if they hit a bump in the road. But anyway, thank you, Trustee Lopez and Chair Kimbell.
Yes, thank you, Jack. So I just had sort of a question and a comment. At first, I wanted to say to Julia's point, and she's had such an incredible depth and breadth of experience in both education and finance that we really need to listen to what she says because she knows. And to that, a couple of things occurred to me. With respect to Romy's comment way back, I understand that when a salary, hike is not exactly, $2, you're not getting $2 in your pocket. But I think it's a bit of a mischaracterization to sort of act as though benefits are not benefiting the employees. I think that they do. So it's, yes, you're not going to be able, you're not getting, say, a $2 raise is not $2 that you can go out and spend or pay on rent, but it will be benefiting. The second point and question was, so the salaries and benefits, if I do my calculations, are close to 40% of our the 23-24 ask or budget that we're putting together for employee salaries and benefits. The second largest ask would be for growing enrollment, but it would seem as if we're going to raise salaries for our faculty and staff, that will necessarily have to go up. Am I right, Steve? Because we're basing that on current salaries, and if we're going to need more employees, more faculty, that necessarily will grow. Is that correct? Am I?
Yeah, thank you, Trustee Campbell. Appreciate you asking that question. The interesting, this is another piece of why this is an unusual year and not like previous years is one thing that did happen in the budget language for the current year, the 21-22 year, is that the legislature and the governor agreed CSU should have higher enrollment, but we're not going to give you the money this year. We're going to give you the money next year. They've not really done that in the past. And so it's a promissory note, sort of, that we're going to add enough money for you to add for your most, your campuses that are at the highest capacity and bursting at the seams. We're going to add roughly north of about 9,000 students to your budget, which is significant. And it's a good thing, but it's not that we, came up with it kind of in a vacuum and said, gee, wouldn't it be nice to, add enrollment next year at this level? This is really something that the legislature feels, particularly the legislature and the leadership there, feel that's very important that CSU needs to be more accessible, particularly at those campuses that are impacted. And so they've made this a priority. So you're right, there's a relationship, but in a way they kind of, the pressure on faculty and staff salaries and the benefits that go along with them is kind of coming from one direction, which is that we just haven't done much in that area in the last couple of years. And then on the enrollment side, you've got the legislature, who I think are getting getting a fair amount of pressure from constituents that are saying, hey, CSU is supposed to be the place that if you do your job, if you get the right grades and you get the right test scores and you take the right courses, you should be able to get a spot in a CSU campus. And so these are kind of coming from different directions.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So I think Chancellor Castro, you had the final question or comment? Sorry, Jeff.
I was muted, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Trustee McGrory and Chair Kimball. I want to just express my thanks to Ryan and Steve for preparing this presentation. We've had a number of discussions before this, and it was very helpful to hear your input. We are listening to the students and the Academic Senate as well, and certainly you saw how we prioritized compensation. So this is, in my opinion, kind of a Rubik's Cube. One of the things that I've spent a lot of time on as your chancellor is getting to know our legislators in Sacramento and the governor. And I do believe that, and I've heard them say this, that when we're together as one CSU family, unified around our requests, we're almost unstoppable, to use Senate Pro Tem Atkins' words a few weeks ago. And so it'll be very important for us to align this with our advocacy efforts. I've had numerous discussions with the governor. He has said to me, please tell me exactly what you need. And he does not want us to increase tuition at this time. And I've said to him, that's not our first priority. We would like to inspire you to invest more. So that's kind of the environment we have with him right now and with the legislative leaders. And my hope is that we can capitalize on what they're viewing as the prominence of CSU in helping to elevate California and to being the inflection point here during the pandemic. We may have to adjust strategy later under different circumstances. But right now, I think this is a strategy that it gives us a maximum chance of success. And if we can stick together as one CSU, I do think we're going to be unstoppable again in our advocacy. So I just wanted to end with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chancellor. Chair Kimball, that concludes the business of the Committee on Finance.
Thank you, Chair McGrory.